and I welcome you to the 2022 New College Lecture. On behalf of the entire New College community, the New College Lectures trustees, the board and staff, our 247 strong student community here at New College, another 260 students at residents at New College Postgraduate Village, and our over 7,000 alumni. Let me begin by warmly welcoming you and as you join us here this evening. As we pause and consider finding yourself, it is also important that we pause and acknowledge the long history of the Bedegal people who are the traditional custodians of this land. On behalf of us all, we'd like to pay our respects to their elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present with us here today. We seem to be emerging from strange times. Last year, Dr. Jenny Brown presented the New College Lectures to a small audience here, but a huge audience elsewhere via Facebook Livestream. In spite of all the complications, Dr. Brown provided a unique perspective on the present epidemic of poor mental health that's sweeping our nation and our world. In terms of our colleges here, we've been actively using Jenny's material on the mental health in community in our practices and in our training of our senior students. I've been promoting her work to similar communities across Australia. This year, the issue of identity, the definition of identity, distinctions between different identities continues to be a vexed conversation. The Reverend Dr. Brian Rosner was the New College lecturer in 2017, and at that time I'd just taken my role as head of our colleges. Brian generously engaged with the students here in college on their views on identity. He shared publicly regarding his own personal identity crisis and some of the associated trauma with that, and you can read about that in the first pages of his previous book, Known by God, Exhibit A, which is available up the back of the room. And senior students in our college communities here, and some of my colleagues at UNSW, know that I enunciate particular but not necessarily popular views on personal identity. So Dr. Rosner's work has been influential on me as I've worked thus far through these important issues. How time flies. Much has transpired since the 2017 New College Lectures, and some of us here were still at high school at that time. Brian has kindly agreed to join us this evening to share his reflections after the 2017 lectures and the preparation of his book, How to Find Yourself, Exhibit B, again available at the rear of the room. And while I rank mental health and climate change as the most important issues to the present emerging generation, I rate the question of personal identity as a fundamental issue underlying much poor mental health and a critical issue that's confronting us as a society and a community. So, I begin by thanking our distinguished lecturer on behalf of those who are able to be here with us at New College this evening and those many others who are joining us via Facebook Livestream, and the others that will hear summaries of this material in the broadcast media. So, briefly, I acknowledge my fellow New College Lecture trustees, the Right Reverend Dr. Michael Stead, Bishop of South Sydney, and Professor David Cohen, President of the University of New South Wales Academic Board. Some distinguished guests who are with us this evening from New College boards, Mrs. Janet Simpson, who's the New College Board Chair, Ms. Jane Pangakulam, the Reverend Dr. Robert Doyle and Mrs. Rosalind Doyle, and Emeritus Professor Christine Alexander, who's also a former Lectures trustee, and Dr. Louis Chubb and Dr. Peter Chubb. We've got a number of distinguished other visitors with us. Emeritus Professor Michael Lawrence from the University of New South Wales and his wife Mrs. Sarah Lawrence, Associate Professor Megan Best from the Institute of Ethics and Society at the University of Notre Dame, Dr. Jenny Brown, who is trainer and manager of the Parent Hope Project, Dr. Greg Clark, until recently CEO of the Australian Institute of Music, and has some of us wondering about wonderful things he'll do next. Maybe he might reveal that later. Dr. James Peach, Principal of Innerborough School, and the Reverend Craig Roberts, CEO of YouthWorks. And on a personal note, I'd like to acknowledge the Reverend Jill Williams, who's joining us this evening and who was a good influence on me when I was much, much younger than I am now. Look, some brief words for those who are not familiar with the new colleges and the new college lectures. We've got 2 leading residential colleges here on the campus of the University of New South Wales, which is one of the most highly ranked universities internationally. New college is in its 54th year, 247 undergraduate students, and an impressive history of graduates who've achieved first in their degree, and a much, much greater number who've gone on to be leaders in their fields. New College Postgraduate Village is across the road, home to 315 postgraduate and senior year undergraduate students. It's in its 14th year, and it's already produced over 100 doctorates at the University of New South Wales. Both colleges enjoy a national reputation for their caring environments, their vibrant communities, and their academic accomplishments, which are 3 core aspects of the college which we value and cultivate with the student leadership teams. Indeed, my view is that safe and supportive university environments inspire each member to contribute to community life and pursue excellence in their own academic endeavours. The lectures are part of our annual calendar of events, and they reflect the college's aspiration. This is the 36th year of the New College Lectures, and which is one of the most long-standing and nationally recognised series in Australia, and has attracted leading thinkers from across the globe. And you can find details on our website. Okay, a little later we'll have questions, and we love questions at the New College Lectures. And this sets us apart from many other lecture series. Anyone gets to ask the lecturer questions except me. And when we get to question time, we'll do our best to get through them all. Tonight there are 2 ways of asking questions. The first thing, there you go, look at that, magic. From anywhere in the world, well, at least in Australia with that number, you can text your question during the lectures or after the lectures to this number that appears at the top of the screen, 0429 373 150, and that question will be captured by our friends up the back and then appear on this laptop over here when we get to the end of the lecture. If you're in the room with us here, you're welcome to put your hand up, and Danny will come to you with a microphone and you can ask your question directly. Housekeeping: if you hear a fire alarm, please just exit the building in an orderly manner from that door over there. And for those listening at home, just exit your residence in a safe and orderly manner if that's okay, and perhaps call the fire brigade. And so also, as I said previously, the bathroom's over here in the corridor on my right, and those that are at home, you know what to do. All right, New College and New College Postgraduate Village are Anglican colleges here at UNSW. If you don't mind, I'm going to dedicate this time to God in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, as we meet here this evening, we thank you for the freedom we have in this country to discuss crucial matters of life and love without fear. We ask for your blessing now upon our lecturer this evening, that you would grant to him clarity of thought and expression. Please grant to us all knowledge of you and a better understanding of who we are and of you and your ways in this world. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. It's now my pleasure to welcome the Reverend Dr. Brian Rosner to address us. Brian gained his PhD from the University of Cambridge and is Principal of Ridley College in Melbourne, having previously lectured at Moore College and the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. He's author and editor of more than a dozen books, including, most recently, How to Find Yourself, Why Looking Inward is Not the Answer. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rosner.
Thanks so much, Master Bill, and everyone who's here and online. It's a great pleasure to come from Melbourne and to be able to boast about the weather. It's an interesting thing to be asked to come back to do the New College lectures, in this case just the one lecture. I'm still not sure if it's a compliment, you did so well last time, let's hear some more, or a reprimand, last time was so bad we want to give you another go. We could take a vote at the end if you like. One way to think about the lecture is a sort of short sequel to the four-part series that was delivered in 2017, maybe as a joy flight over some of the main sites before we land and you can go hiking on the full trail. To do that, you'll need to look at the book. So I think in a lecture like this, where I'm trying to summarise a book in 4 other lectures, you'll hear the word briefly quite often, and you'll also hear some shameless plugs for the book along the way. You could play kind of lecture bingo, if you like, with those 2 terms. My topic, as Bill said, is personal identity, your favourite subject, if you like, you. The question each of us asks at different points in our lives: what defines you? What makes you you? Specifically, I want to also give a Christian response to the dominant strategy of identity formation in our day, namely expressive individualism. Expressive individualism views identity formation as a kind of do-it-yourself project. All forms of external authority are to be rejected. Everyone's quest for self-expression should be celebrated. It's the view that you are who you feel yourself to be on the inside, and acting in accordance with this identity constitutes living authentically. Indeed, most people today in the West believe that there is just one place to look to find yourself, and that is inward. New York Times columnist David Brooks writes, "When you're figuring out how to lead your life, people today feel that the most important answers are found deep inside yourself." Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor puts it this way: "Modern freedom and autonomy centres us on ourselves, and the ideal of authenticity requires that we discover and articulate our own identity." You don't need to look far today to notice that personal identity is a do-it-yourself project. A gym near where I live advertises itself with the slogan, "Be fit, be well, be you." A new apartment complex around the corner, offering high-end luxury design, carries the byline, "An unlimited you." On my way to work, I pass an expensive private school which advertises itself with the words, "Be inspired, be challenged, be excellent, be you." Self-determination, rather than being a principle for nations at the end of the First World War, is now the responsibility of every individual. So what's changed since 2017? Just a quick poll. Who was actually here in 2017? Wow, okay. That's encouraging, I guess. A few things have changed. Firstly, there's been a growth of interest in finding yourself by looking inward and expressive individualism, which I'll detail in a moment, or at least sample. There are many books now that have been written and articles on identity, both from Christian and mainstream points of view. And the third thing is that my book has come out and is on sale. Expressive individualism continues to grow in its reach and dominance. Donald Trump said, "Be true to yourself and your country. Always have the courage to be yourself." That was at a university commencement. The admirable Australian of the Year, Dylan Alcott, gave this advice: "Be yourself and watch your world change. The hardest thing to understand is that it's the easiest thing in the world to do." Meghan Markle, when she released her much anticipated Archetypes podcast, put it this way: "Listeners can expect the real me. I'm just excited to be myself." Last time in 2017, I talked about Matt Damon movies, Born Identity, etc., as centering on entertainment around the topic of identity. This time I'll mention something I watched recently, Inventing Anna, on the Netflix series. An audacious entrepreneurial con artist, a journalist, chases down the story of Anna Delvey, who convinced New York's elites that she was a German heiress. Who is Anna Delvey? That's the kind of plot, story arc of the whole series. One woman wrote of her experience of leaving her marriage in mainstream media quite recently. She wrote this: "Even though I was that woman who broke up a family and caused pain, obstacles and challenges for myself and those around me, I'm also the person who was courageous enough to stand up and speak my truth. And although I lost many relationships, I gained the most important one, my true self. I found me." Will Smith earnestly intoned, "Nobody knows but you. You can't get advice on what you should do with your life. Nobody knows what you are. Sometimes you don't even know what you are." Shane Warne told a close friend just a year before his untimely death, "Do you know, I feel as if I'm searching for myself a bit. I'm always busy and got everything, but I'm not totally happy. Taylor Swift receiving her honorary doctorate at New York University. That's actually true. We are so many things all the time, and I know it can be overwhelming figuring out who to be. I have some good news. It's totally up to you. I also have some terrifying news. It's totally up to you. What else has happened since 2017? Well, studies of identity are certainly on the rise. It's an odd thing. It's probably testimony to the fact that we're social beings, that you think you're saying something original, and lots of other people are saying very similar things at the same time. I'll mention just three authors. Francis Fukuyama, the brilliant American political scientist. I'll mention some quotes from his book on identity as we go through, but two I want to just give little cameo appearances here. The American historian and theologian Carl Truman, who wrote the foreword to my book, and then also Stan Grant, the also brilliant journalist, Indigenous journalist and academic. So first of all, Carl Truman. He's written two books recently on the topic: The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism and the Road to Sexual Revolution. It's a long book. It's kind of highbrow. I listened to it on audiobook during the long lockdowns in Melbourne in the last couple of years. Then he's also got, it's not quite an idiot's guide, but it's certainly more accessible, Strange New World: How Thinkers and Activists Redefined Identity and Sparked the Sexual Revolution. Now, thinking of Carl's work as tracing the roots of expressive individualism, my own work attempts to look at the fruit of the the fruit of the movement, to extend the metaphor, and somewhere else to plant yourself. Truman points to a confluence of a host of factors to explain the cultural normativity of the expressive individual self, including technology, politics, popular culture, scientific progress, science, and so on. He concentrates on the intellectual roots, he is a modern historian after all, that he thinks explains how we got to the point of thinking that the only place to find yourself is inward. His focus, as the titles suggest, is on the sexual revolution as a sharp manifestation of expressive individualism, which is not my focus. So I'll just head you off at the pass there. I think the topic, he agrees, is much more broadly of interest than simply that intensely personal, of course, but more limited focus. Truman admits that the figures who laid the foundation are rarely read today. I think I've only read one of them, actually. But their ideas are part of what he calls our social imaginary, the kind of unquestioned cultural intuitions that each of us carry around even without realising perhaps where they come from. So I'll give you four highlights from the last 4 centuries, give you a taste. The first is the 17th century philosopher Rene Descartes and his famous dictum, "I think, therefore I am." Now, what defines you is your own thoughts about yourself, is the kind of idea. Then the 18th century Genevan philosopher, I think this is the highlight of the book actually, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the artistic movement of Romanticism. Rousseau writes in his autobiographical Confessions, many of you will know that Augustine wrote an autobiography called The Confessions. I don't think that's an accident. Rousseau writes of his desire, quote, "to make known my inner self." And he writes, "All I need to do is to look inside myself." So that was back in the 18th century. For Rousseau, the original pristine individual is the truly authentic one. Then the Romantics in art and literature accordingly granted authority to personal feelings as the true guide to who you are. Next, according to Truman, we get to the 19th century. He has a few things in between. I'm just giving you the highlights. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche struck at the heart of the notion of absolute moral standards and insisted that human beings must rise to the challenge of self-creation. Again, one of the fundamental aspects of expressive individualism. Then in the 20th century, the Austrian psychiatrist Sigmund Freud established the idea that sex is foundational to human happiness and personal identity. Now, there is, of course, much more to say, and not being a modern historian, I don't want to say any more, but they are some of the turning points, I think, in the last several centuries, and shows that the roots of what we're experiencing today, expressive individualism, are very deep. That which has led to the notion of a self-made self and the priority of looking inward. The second thinker since I gave the lectures in 2017 I want to talk about is Stan Grant, and what I would describe as his doubts about expressive individualism. So Stan has, I shouldn't say that, I don't know him, Grant has a book called On Identity, and he also wrote a number of articles, one I'll just mention briefly, called The Death of God. So, brilliant journalist and academic Grant has this short book and had written several articles suggesting that the abandonment of Christian faith in Western society has led to our obsession with identity issues. He's got this probing style which raises, I think, serious questions about the success of the movement of expressive individualism. In his article, The Death of God, Grant argues that we've swapped God for a culture of authenticity, or expressive individualism, his words, in which people are encouraged to find their own way, discover their own fulfillment, to do their own thing. In his view, while historically the West was founded on Christian values and principles, the modern West was shaped by a break with God. People are now sovereign. Personal freedom prevails over all transcendent standards. Society is now ordered on new values founded on individualism, freedom, and the valorisation of desire. Again, quoting Grant. According to Grant, the West is a place beyond history. The past is now another country. Tradition is seen as stifling, old-fashioned. This has led to a dearth of purpose and spirit. Again, I'm just paraphrasing Grant. We can't agree on who we are or what we are about, or even if these big existential questions matter. In the West, identity is the new faith, is the way he puts it. We are free to reimagine and reinvent ourselves, untethered from the past, from family or faith. And in his view, modern individualism has impoverished the character and content of collective life. In his book on identity, thinking of his own identity as an Indigenous man, he has a couple of points that I want to point out where he also expresses some doubts about the project we're in the middle of. He points out the difficulty of assigning one identity marker with reference to filling out something as innocuous as the census form. Now, you imagine Grant would just tick Indigenous, and he's clearly had lots of very helpful things to say about the serious issues of injustice against Indigenous people throughout Australia's history. Does he check the box for Indigenous? If he does, isn't that a denial of his non-Indigenous grandmother, about whom he writes very affectionately and has a great debt to? He complains, quote, "I will not be anything that does not include my grandmother. I will not put a mark in the box that someone has decided contains me." According to Grant, some people with an Indigenous background likewise prefer not to be boxed into a category. Grant introduced Cody Bedford on his 1+1 interview program with the words, "She was a journalist, she was a writer, she's a storyteller. Just don't call her an Aboriginal storyteller." So I think it's fair to say, according to Grant, I think I agree, identity is often more complicated than the group labels we're being stuck with today, which frequently only tell part of a bigger and richer story. Stan Grant has a balanced take on the story of social justice and identity politics as they relate to his own Indigenous Australian heritage. Notice his insistence that social justice is a narrative identity, a story we enter, both with great explanatory power and with clear limitations. I quote, he writes, "This has become a powerful narrative for many Indigenous Australians. It's a history I was raised on, the story of invasion and dispossession, racism and segregation, passed down through the generations of my family. These stories are painful and vivid. They have marked me. At times, I have felt indelibly. History is where we locate ourselves. It's the foundation of identity. It can help explain so much ongoing suffering and injustice. But it can become a crippling narrative. It has been my struggle, the struggle of all of us, to move beyond it. Not to ignore it or airbrush the worst aspects, but to lift its weight from my shoulders. I have no desire to be bound to a history of misery, or worse, to revel in it." So enough of recent trends. In the rest of my lecture, I'll attempt to do an audit of the movement of expressive individualism. For a full 360, you'll need to see my book. I'll also, as I've said, commend a Christian approach to finding yourself. Now, much of what I've got to say is critical, but first I think we should acknowledge the benefits of looking inwards. So the title of my book is How to Find Yourself, Why Looking Inward is Not the Answer. I said to the publisher, well, I actually favour looking inward to some extent, so should we call it Why Looking Inward is Not the Whole Answer, or Why Only Looking Inward is Not the Answer? But of course that wouldn't sell, so they dumped that and told me just to clarify things in the book. I can think of at least 3 benefits of looking inward that expressive individualism has brought in our day: inclusion, self-reflection, and authenticity. First, inclusion. Expressive individualism is driven by the admirable desire to see many marginalised groups in society affirmed as full members and given appropriate dignity. Many individuals with identity markers different from the mainstream, even in relatively harmonious multicultural societies, long for recognition and acceptance. They might be to do with gender, to do with race, sexuality, and so on. Other groups are attracted to the movement for the freedom it offers in terms of life choices. Many argue that expressive individualism has won some major social gains. So that's inclusion. Another benefit is self-reflection. In principle, of course, there's nothing wrong with looking inward. Personal exploration is commendable, and self-reflection acknowledges the gains of living an examined life. If you think about it, the alternative is far from attractive. Indeed, the movement of expressive individualism is in part a reaction against a 1950s culture of conformity. Being born right at the end of the 1950s, I don't want to speak too heavily against them, and I think they've got a bad rap actually, but nonetheless, I think expressive individualism has a point. 1950s were thought, at least, to be a period which crushed individuality and creativity, was too concerned with production and concrete results, repressed feeling and spontaneity, and exalted the mechanical over the organic. Self-reflection. Inclusion. Thirdly, authenticity. Clearly, authenticity as a moral ideal is also commendable, especially if the alternative is a blind conformity to external demands that can lead to hypocrisy when people fail to live up to key aspects of their own lives. It's much better for a person to inhabit an identity that they own and can fully appropriate for themselves. Colloquially, it's good to feel comfortable in your own skin. Psychologists regard authenticity as a basic requirement of mental health. Quote, authenticity is correlated with many aspects of psychological well-being, including vitality, self-esteem, and coping skills. Acting in accordance with one's core self, a trait called self-determination, is ranked by some experts as one of the 3 basic psychological needs. So at the end of the lecture, I'll actually come back to these and attempt to show that a Christian approach to identity formation can connect with each of those 3 And seeing this is the board we're now playing on, we need to accept that and contextualise the Christian message accordingly. That's the positives. Now, a more critical evaluation of the self-made self. This is the first point, expressive individualism is a novel idea in human history. And even today, anywhere outside the postmodern West, it's incomprehensible. Notwithstanding Carl Truman's work on the social imaginary roots. Anthropologist Clifford Geertz puts it well, even if a little abstrusely. I love the word abstrusely because I'm not really sure what it means, but that's the point. The Western conception of the person as a bounded, unique, more or less integrated motivational and cognitive universe, a dynamic centre of awareness, emotion, judgment and action organised into a distinctive whole and set contrastively both against other wholes and against its social and natural background, is, however incorrigible it may seem to us, immovable, unchangeable, a rather peculiar idea within the context of the world's cultures. It's what happens when you're an anthropologist, apparently. You write very long sentences. But you get the point, don't you? This is such a new and novel thing that it really is worth wondering whether it's working. So notwithstanding the benefits, which I've enumerated, given its novelty, what are the downsides to a self-made self? I see three, and for ease of memory, they all start with F. The self-made self is fragile, it's failing to lead to the good life for most people, and it's faulty in its foundations. First of all, and I hide behind some bigger thinkers than me at each point. First of all, the self-made self is fragile. Fukuyama writes, confusion over identity arises as a condition of living in the postmodern world. So along with the exciting opportunity to find yourself comes the daunting prospect of not succeeding or of not liking what you find. And the cruel irony is that while it's never been more important to know who you are, it's never been more difficult. So in the past, you would just have an identity given to you by your parents and you could modify, accept or change that in your adolescence. And then if you're unlucky, you had a midlife crisis and then you retired and soon you were gone. These days, you can have a crisis anytime you like. So there's a thrisis, which is not something you need ointment for. It's something when you're in your 30s and you climb the ladder of success only to find it's leaning against the wrong building. You can have cuspiety, which is what life stage experts say happens when you hit 40, 50, 60, 70 and so on. You kind of think, oh my goodness, what has happened to me? Where did my life go? Why didn't I do all those things I wanted to do? I've spoken to lots of people over the last 25 years on this topic, and many have resonated from all sorts of different contexts. People have lost their parents, people who've changed jobs, people with relationship breakdown, people who've changed their jobs regularly. Who am I in such circumstances? Kevin Van Hooser, theologian, writes, the human race is suffering from a collective identity crisis. Recall Will Smith's sage advice, sometimes you don't even know what you are. And Taylor Swift, it's totally up to you, which is good news and also terrifying news. I think she's right. So I think the focus on the self generates a fragile self, easily destabilised and lacking in genuine and lasting self-knowledge. Perhaps social media also bears some responsibility. C.S. Lewis talks about incessant autobiography. He's actually talking about Satan in Paradise Regained or Lost. Which was it, Greg? Yeah. Paradise Lost. And I think it actually applies to our day today because on all the platforms of social media, you've got the opportunity for self-definition. You can present the pictures, the stories, The whole take on your life, you can narrate it. It's obviously a heavily edited version and a lot glossier than it is in reality. But nonetheless, there's this sense in which we've got unprecedented opportunities for self-definition. But many studies have shown that excessive use can lead to an unhealthy thirst for the approval and validation of others. I speak from experience. To the masking rather than expressing of identity, and sadly, in the end, to loneliness and self-doubt. So it's quite ironic, isn't it, that that tool of self-expression, self-definition, can actually work against self-definition. So the self-made self, I don't think there's any doubt about this, produces a fragile self. The self-made self is also, it seems, failing to lead to the good life. Now again, I'm not on my own here. Lots of social critics have pointed out the kind of things I'll talk about in a moment. In the 2000, first of all, Fukuyama. The problem is that the inner selves we are celebrating may be cruel, violent, narcissistic, or dishonest, or they may simply be lazy and shallow. So the assumption that I look inside and want everyone to celebrate what I find might not be entirely appropriate. In the 2017 lectures, I had 4 tests of the good life, each beginning with E, and I concluded that the self-made self was coming up short on those 4 tests. Since then, I've added a 5th test on the advice of a student, namely the enjoyment test, happiness and pleasure. So I'm sure you'll remember the first 4 tests from 2017. I'll just say something about the 5th test. The enjoyment test, happiness and pleasure. How does the self-made self do on that test? Well, the self-made self is surely expected to perform very well here. After all, it is for the sake of individual freedom and pleasure that expressive individualism opposes such things as traditions, religions, received wisdom, regulation, and social ties. That's not to say that the self-made self is always an excuse for a shallow and selfish hedonism, so I'm not being unreasonable here, I don't think. But there is no doubt that happiness and pleasure are high on its agenda. Now, there's much to say about this, so just briefly. Most would agree that the greatest source of happiness in life consists in relationships, both family and friends. Clearly, close personal relationships are an essential element for human well-being and a major factor in the good life. Well, in the UK, it was reported that more than 9 million people often or always feel lonely. And in 2017, a Minister for Loneliness was appointed. I think the link between self-definition and the breakdown of social obligation is clear. Self-reliance leaves little place for interdependence. There's also what we might call the happiness paradox. The more you focus on being happy, the harder it seems to find. A recent study conducted by the University of Melbourne, that's the other city with the good weather, showed that overemphasising the importance of happiness actually results in an increase of unhappiness. It's a bit like trying to get a good night's sleep. The more you try, the harder it gets. A good night's sleep is actually the byproduct of something else. So also with happiness. The study highlighted that the external pressure we feel to be happy, the more a participant felt pressured to feel not sad or anxious, the more likely they were to report an increase in depressive symptoms. It was amusingly entitled, "Don't always look on the bright side of life. The pursuit of happiness at the expense of other emotions may paradoxically be making us sad." Arguably, the self-made self misses the mark when it comes to the enjoyment test by naively assuming a direct link between the satisfaction of desire and the lasting pleasure and happiness we all crave. I forget who said it, but some wit said there are 2 tragedies in life: not getting what you want and getting it. Many widely reported societal trends suggest that we are in trouble on all 5 tests. Rises in cases of anxiety and depression, an explosion in narcissism, the absence of compassion in our society, our culture of reflexive outrage, and as I've just detailed briefly, the fall in the happiness index. Now, all cultural commentators see problems in our world that are acute. People point in many different directions to explain these unfortunate societal trends. Not enough mindfulness, technology addling our brains, crowd behaviour, the failure of major institutions, politicians, churches, media, banks, loss of shared values, absence of community cohesion, and so on. However, some of these, I think, are symptoms rather than causes of our malaise. I suggest that a shift in the way that we do identity formation in our day is a big part of the problem. A third F. The reason that expressive individualism is fragile and failing is that it rests on faulty foundations. The biggest problem with only looking inward to find ourselves is that it's hopelessly reductionistic and ignores crucial dimensions of what it means to be a human being. There are, in fact, three other directions to look to find yourself. We should look around to our relationships. We're known by being known by others. We should look back and forth to our shared stories, and we should look upwards to God. I'll come back to that. So, to put it this way, human identity does not exist in isolation. It cannot be defined without reference to the narrative in which it finds itself, and it cannot help but look up. We are profoundly social, deeply story-driven, and we have eternity in our hearts. Reminds me of Arthur Stace, who became a Christian hearing that sermon in the 1930s, I think, in Barney's on Broadway, and then wrote Eternity Everywhere. And then when the millennium changed in the year 2000, 1st of January, we had emblazoned on the Harbour Bridge in his handwriting, Eternity. And there were no objections. You would have expected in godless city like Sydney to have something like Oblivion put up on the Harbour Bridge. But instead, Eternity stood there. The human species is often classified as Homo sapiens, from the Latin, which means wise person. However, I think we are just as well, if not more accurately, categorised as Homo sociologicus, social beings, Homo narratus, storytelling beings, and Homo adorans, worshipping beings. Now, the third direction, the worshipping beings, is of course the most controversial, given that not everyone professes faith in God. Certainly, faith in traditional understandings of God is in decline in the West. It's not in Africa and Asia, in the majority world. And spirituality hasn't gone anywhere either. That's on the rise in the West. Yet I do think that looking up, one way or another, seems to be an irrepressible human urge. Now, an admittedly subjective argument for the human attraction to the transcendent is the observation that each of us wants something more simply than the satisfaction of our most basic desires. Authors across a range of traditions, both religious and otherwise, have noted such yearnings, longings. C.S. Lewis, for example, wrote of the human capacity for, quote, an inconsolable longing for we know not what. In The Pilgrim's Regress, he describes the object of such longing as, quote, that unnamed something, desire for which pierces us like a rapier at the smell of the bonfire, the sound of wild ducks flying overhead, the title of the well at the world's end, the morning cobwebs in late summer, or the noise of falling waves. Such yearnings are, Lewis says, good images of what we really desire. But they are not the thing itself. They are only the scent of the flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have not yet visited. So human beings, I think it's fair to say, universally this is seen, are afflicted, or perhaps blessed, with a nostalgia for the garden, a painful yearning for a perfect past. Speaking personally, my heart is impressed by antiquity, searches for wisdom, yearns for justice, needs hope, loves beauty, senses my own darkness, is appalled by evil, is repulsed by death, and aches for the reassurance of a satisfying story to make sense of my existence. The experience of such strong desires unfulfilled by life on earth are for me a strong motivation to look up and seek God. So, we look up in one way or another, is something I'll come back to as well. To find ourselves then, let's take the other directions first. We also look around. We have a social identity. Sociologist David Jopling puts it this way: the self is too complexly configured to be accessible to a single finite mind inquiring into itself by itself. And then back to Francis Fukuyama. Most people do not have infinite depths of individuality that is theirs alone. What they believe to be their true inner self is actually constituted by their relationships with other people. We have what was called in the 1920s a looking glass self. We know ourselves by being known, having ourselves reflected back to us through our closest relationships. If you're married, you'll know that is the case, and sometimes quite painfully. You and I like to think of ourselves as boldly expressing our individuality in order to find our true selves, but the truth is that rather than being a single soaring eagle eyeing our prey from a great height, we are more like a honking goose in tight V formation. But don't misunderstand my goose analogy. It's not about repressive conformity, but interdependence. Like geese in formation, we humans are wired to be interdependent, secure in a network of relationships with invisible connections and indissoluble ties. And as any goose will tell you, it's the only way to fly. In terms of humans as social beings, parents knowing their children is particularly important for a child's sense of identity. Parents not only reflect back to their children their identities, but also play a big role in forming those identities. Children are named by their parents, receive their earliest experiences. Parents pass on their own tastes, values and worldview to their children. Indeed, parents play a big part in the formation and maintenance of their children's identity, especially when they are young. At best, parents are those who know us well and hold a more complete memory of our lives than anyone else. In this connection, doing the looking up one, so I've kind of got looking around and how does looking up relate to looking around. The Bible connects being known intimately and personally by God to our identity as his children. And the Bible sees being known by God taking primacy over knowing God. In Galatians, Paul writes, "Formerly, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who were by nature not God's. But now that you know God, or rather are known by him." Significantly, the main characters in the Old Testament are explicitly said to be known intimately and personally by God, including Abraham, Moses, David, Jeremiah, and the entire nation of Israel, and also the church in the New Testament. Being known by God is directly connected to the question of identity. We're not talking about God's omniscience, that he knows everyone at all times, which is really connected to his omnipresence, the fact that he's everywhere. We're talking about his personal knowledge, which is connected to his love. Some languages distinguish those two types of knowledge. In German, for example, you've got two different verbs for knowing about and knowing someone. So what we're talking about is knowing someone. Believers in Christ are known by God in the same way then that a parent knows their child. When Paul describes the Galatian Christians in Galatians 4 as those who are known by God, in context he has the theme of adoption in mind. If you look at chapters 3 and 4, you'll see that. Looking around to others to know ourselves is a human thing to do. And we are known intimately and personally by God as his child, which gives us great comfort and significance and a stable sense of self. Speaking personally, my own experience of some kind of crisis of identity in the mid-90s was very much helped by taking seriously this concept that if I didn't know who I was anymore, God knew me personally. And Nahum 1 verse 8 indicates the kind of comfort that can bring in the moment of confusion, where it says, The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble. He knows those who take refuge in him. Now, by the way, this theme is slightly obscured in many translations, so it's sometimes translated, he takes care of those, he chose us, rather than he knows us. But I think the verb to know works in English as well. So you're a social being, you're also a storytelling being. So looking backwards and forwards to your story is how we find our identities. And as we've said, telling your own story is at the heart of expressive individualism. So looking backward and forward, three authors to reinforce this notion. Jonathan Gottschall has an amazing book called The Storytelling Beings. Our life stories are who we are. They are our identity. Tim Keller writes, everyone lives and operates out of some narrative identity, whether it's thought out and reflected upon or not. And Alistair McGrath has written, the story we believe we are in determines what we think about ourselves and consequently how we live. So your story is fundamental to your personal identity, but it's not an individual story. Being social animals, we live in shared stories. The meta-narrative or big story in which each of us lives is a combination of defining moments, goals and expectations of life related to the stories handed to us by our families and related to the stories of our nations, ethnicities, social classes, and religious faiths. In my view, there are two big stories to which the vast majority of people in the West subscribe today, and these are playing a big role in forming people's identities. They are the story of secular materialism and the story of social justice. Both are fueled by the movement of expressive individualism. And like any good story, they have a basic plot and setting, key turning points, central themes, stock characters, conflicts to be resolved, and an anticipated climax. And while they are understandably attractive in many ways, both, I think, are seriously flawed. As life stories go, they're ultimately unsatisfying because they have a truncated view of human nature and, in my view, a distorted view of reality. Now, I'm not suggesting that the narrative identity of every person in the West follows one of these two scripts, secular materialism and social justice. Rather, they're two dominant personal identity stories that find varied expression in a number of different settings and contexts. It's even possible to subscribe to a mishmash of both. Human beings are notoriously inconsistent. These two big stories are like literary genres that house a number of subgenres. Just as the genre of drama comes in crime, teen, horror and legal versions, and comedy can be black, romantic and slapstick. Under secular materialism, we might consider, and I do in the book, the subgenres of Enlightenment progress, the sexual revolution and consumerism. And under social justice, we could look at the narratives of the marginalised and their allies and the oppressors. Now, when I say their allies, the word we have sometimes used is the woke, but I think as soon as you say the woke nowadays, you're in the culture wars, and when it comes to culture wars, I'm a pacifist. So, briefly, the stories of secular materialism. As I mentioned, there are three versions. In my view, just to cut to the chase, such narratives are going nowhere. They're stories that fail to deliver on their promises by misjudging the effect of ever-increasing personal freedom and underestimating the depths of human depravity. They look up, but not to things worthy of devotion. They look up to gods that fail. In the end, those living the stories of secular materialism can fall prey to idols that fail to bring the security, significance, and satisfaction that each of us craves. Those idols might be human progress in general, sexual fulfillment, or material possessions. The story of social justice is much more complicated. And in the book, I wrote this chapter 3 times, having had friends read it who said, you can't say that. And it was easily the most difficult chapter to write. And the truth is that there's good reason for that. As Zechariah 7, 9 and 10 puts it, the Bible is in big favour of social justice. Administer true justice. Show mercy and compassion to one another. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the foreigner or the poor. So the story of social justice views the world as a place of cruel injustice, whereby resources and opportunities are unevenly distributed, privilege is concentrated on a few, and action needs to be taken to create societies that promote diversity and equality. Now, I want to point out up front, as this text shows, that the Bible teaches that we should be committed to the care and protection of all people, especially the marginalised and disadvantaged. And unlike secular materialism, the story of social justice is consciously attractive to many Christians, and for good reason. There's just too much to say, but briefly, a major issue with the story of social justice is that those following its script can often wear thick and distorting lenses with which to view the world and blinkers to screen out information that doesn't fit the narrative. The story of human rights in the 20th century is actually one of progress and steady accumulation, but sometimes the swell of social justice proponents today acts as if things have never been worse. Doubtless, there is more to be done, but the rhetoric can be overblown. It's one thing to identify an inequity. It's quite another to propose a solution that will actually make a difference, let alone fix things and not make things worse. Pretending there are easy and obvious answers to complex problems is unhelpful. And to some extent, I hide behind Stan Grant here, who said some similar things. The idea that prejudice and discrimination, in addition, are all that is wrong with the world and is confined to one group, the oppressors. Remember, you've got the oppressed, their allies, and the oppressors, I think is unhelpful. The distribution of human evil is far deeper and wider. All three supposedly discrete groups, the oppressed, their allies, and the oppressors, have their distinctive failings. The oppressors may well be prone to prejudice, discrimination, bigotry, and nepotism. The oppressed can fall into a place of irresponsible laziness and entitlement, destructive envy and bitterness, and their allies can be guilty of self-righteousness, bullying, and groupthink. All three groups should be wary, as we all should be wary, of pride, greed, sexual exploitation, selfish ambition, corruption, violence, deception, ruthlessness, malice, and raw self-interest. Human evil is the original diverse and inclusive industry. Overall, then, I judge the story of social justice to be an inadequate basis for a narrative identity. For all its good intentions, it has serious fault lines running through its foundation. It can lead to an unhealthy sense of entitlement, it can be divisive, and it offers, most significantly, I think, an incomplete diagnosis of what is wrong with humanity. And although its transformative vision of the future is inspiring and worthy, it lacks the means to get there. Is there a better story to live within? I'm going to suggest that there is, and it's called the life story of Jesus Christ. Now, looking up gives us a new and better story to live. And I say to live within because basically the expressive individual stories have you as the star actor, the director, the illustrator, the narrator, the marketing department, and everything else about your story. So don't mishear me. The story of God's people, which is based on the life story of Jesus Christ, only gives you a bit part. So looking up gives us a new and better story in which to live. This story offers the ultimate indictment of expressive individualism. It asserts that you don't have it within yourself to define yourself. You need an intervention from out with yourself, to use my favourite Scottish preposition. It's both the bleakest and the brightest story on offer, pessimistic about human nature, but instilled with a glorious hope. Intriguingly, it's based on someone else's life story, based on the story of Jesus Christ. And I've got on the screen. I thought I did, I still do. Colossians 3, 3 and 4. I've done my own translation here. Principals are allowed to do that. You died, and your identity is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life story, appears, you will also appear with him in glory. And then Colossians 3, 5 and following, 5 to 17, goes on to explain that even though this identity is a gift, it's to be put on. So putting on the new self then is at the heart of the Christian faith. Believers in Christ are those who have died with Christ, who've been raised with him, and whose destiny is tied up with his glorious appearing. If only we had some rite to kind of instill that. It's called baptism. And if only we had a regular meal to do that, to reinforce that, it's called communion. The cross then is meant to define us. It's not just about what saves us, it's about what makes us God's people and who we are. Modern identity formation is riddled with embarrassing ironies, yawning gulfs that open up between what is asserted and appears to be the case and an unfortunate reality. In many ways, expressive individualism is leading to outcomes that are the opposite of what we hope for. We're told to look inward to find ourselves, but inevitably we look to the approval of others to shore up our sense of self. We use social media to define ourselves, but the same tools leave us more exposed than ever. We pursue our desires with a passion, but even when we get them, we are left feeling discontent and dissatisfied. We seek to rid the world of prejudice and discrimination, but to bring that about, we invent new forms of prejudice and discrimination. We regard religion as the imposition of an oppressive external authority, only to find ourselves looking up to things unworthy of our devotion that enslave and dehumanise us. We seek to live our unique stories, only to find ourselves plugging into big shared stories. The biggest irony was said by Jesus 2,000 years ago. It's one of his favourite sayings. It's in all four Gospels. It's this. It's a paradox, which is kind of a profound irony. Whoever finds themselves will lose themselves, but whoever loses themselves for my sake will find themselves. So Jesus actually speaks into this movement of expressive individualism and says the way to truly find yourself is to be found and to give up looking for yourself, and then your true self will be found in the end. To find yourself in the first part of the verse is really the equivalent of pursuing a self-made self. It's to find your own way, to seek your own personal happiness above all else, to focus on pursuing your life dreams, to follow relentlessly your own path with little thought to those around you who might get in your way. Now, Jesus is not, of course, condemning ambition or achievement in and of itself. Rather, finding yourself in the first half of this saying is about focused self-creation. According to Jesus, in the ultimate tragic irony, seeking to establish your own identity results in losing your identity. According to Jesus, in order to find yourself, your true and lasting identity, you need to relinquish the quest for self-assertion and look in another direction. Jesus opposes the notion that to know yourself, you need to find yourself. The paradox of personal identity is that those who gaze inwardly to find themselves will lose their identities, but when you look elsewhere, you will find your true self. Another saying in the New Testament, which seems to have been coined in direct contradiction to expressive individualism, is where Paul rejects personal autonomy in 1 Corinthians 6. Could you imagine a more heretical thing to say in our day than "you are not your own"? It sounds like a violation of human rights. And yet the gospel of Jesus teaches that you are not your own in countercultural fashion. Yet even in our day, insisting on the priority and benefits of personal autonomy, there are some contexts in which belonging to someone else is seen in a positive light. A young child lost in a shopping mall makes no complaint when his mother turns up and claims him as her own. Likewise, while it's open to terrible abuse, true romantic love has at its heart a mutual belonging. Countless love songs, starting with the Song of Solomon in the Bible, I think this is the earliest time in any literature where you'll find this notion, contains this refrain, "My beloved is mine and I am his." In the ancient world, all men thought that their wife belonged to them, but nowhere in the ancient world do you get both, except in the Song of Songs and then in the New Testament, and then it becomes more common. The wife belongs to the husband belongs to the wife. Now that's open to terrible abuse, of course, but I think in the right context, it's a beautiful thing. Indeed, given the social animals that we are, nothing gives us more of a sense of value and worth than being loved to such an extent that we belong to another. Far from distressing or oppressive, such an embrace reassures and liberates us. Indeed, love is the context of Paul's startling assertion, "You are not your own." Should still be up there. The words following Paul's rejection of personal autonomy explain why you belong to another. You were bought at a price. To all who are in Christ, the cross of Christ proclaims that God has claimed you as his very own. You belong to him. But surrendering yourself in this way does not lead to the eradication of yourself or any kind of oppressive subjugation. In fact, in losing yourself and belonging to one who loves you with an everlasting love, you will find your true self. Finally, and briefly, the gospel and values of expressive individualism. So I mentioned three of them: inclusion, self-reflection, and authenticity. This lecture, I've sought to offer a critique of expressive individualism, claiming that it's fragile, failing, and faulty, even if it has benefits. Along with pointing out the shortcomings, I've also sought to commend a positive alternative strategy of identity formation, looking in other directions in addition to inward, around to your relationships, backwards and forwards to your story, and up to God for your most defining relationship and to become part of his story. Earlier I noted some of the benefits, those three. Here I want to suggest very briefly that the Bible's approach to identity, when properly undertaken, can also bring these benefits. The community that is living the life story of Jesus Christ should be inclusive in the best sense. Now, I confess up front that's not always the case, and many people I've met have had bad experiences in churches. But churches are to be groups of people who don't normally belong together, united on an equal basis. As Paul says in Colossians, here there is no Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free. Christian faith, now, by the way, that's not obliterating those cultural backgrounds and distinctives. What Paul's saying is that they are not all important. They're still important for identity, and they're maintained in the biblical narrative. So you will still be your ethnicity, nationality, gender, etc. But they're not all important to who you are. Christian faith at its best brings a unity without obliterating cultural differences or making one culture dominate another. And the basis for that unity is the mutual love of Christ, who loves us all and gave himself for us. Secondly, the value of self-reflection is actually anticipated in the Bible. Paul sees us as whole beings determined from within. Humans have an inner being, but the inner person is not there to be discovered, affirmed, and celebrated unconditionally, but rather strengthened and renewed. Paul prays, "I pray that according to the riches of his glory, he may grant you to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your heart through faith." Paul counsels in Romans 12 to think about yourself with sober judgment, self-reflection. Thirdly, authenticity. As it turns out, the value of living authentic lives true to ourselves is the heart of the Bible's call to moral transformation. The Bible knows that knowing who you are leads to conduct in keeping with your identity. Identity and conduct go together. That's the point of much Christian doctrine, reminding us who we are in Christ. I think in that light, it's imperative in our day for Christian teaching and identity to be expressed in forms familiar to our current context. And evangelists and missiologists can do this better than me, but such a project is needing to be undertaken. It's a challenge that needs to be met. There's ample scope. Should you be true to yourself? Be true to your new self. Should you do you? You should do the new you. time for friendly questions.
As we said previously, please text any questions to that number, or you can put your hand up and Danny will come to you and you can ask your question of Brian. So I'm just getting the screen up here, guys, so that we can actually see questions that come through on the text. So, questions, please. You better stand there because you're going to answer.
Yep. Are you going to read them, or do you want me to? There's some there already.
Oh, no, they're not. They're just tested.
Oh, okay.
Cool. So, Andrew will come to you in just a second. Can you give the first 4 E's of the good life?
Yes, I can. They're listed on that slide, I thought. So rather than embarrass myself, I'll find them and say a few words about each of them. So the existential test, suffering and disappointment, I think it's fair to say people are less and less well equipped to cope with suffering and disappointment. Hugh Mackay, the excellent social researcher, claims that many people today are being sold a kind of utopia complex. Everything is going to turn out well, you just follow your dreams, etc. I think actually the pandemic kind of put a bit of a damper on that. That's probably changed since 2017 as well. But nonetheless, there's good reason to think that we're not doing well coping with hardship. The egotism test, it's not hard to imagine, is it? That if you focus exclusively within yourself, then you'll end up with a destructive pride and unfortunate envy. Pride is really not just thinking too much of yourself, but thinking too much about yourself. And humility is really thinking about others. In humility, think of others as more important than yourself. The Apostle Paul says in Philippians 2. The ethics test, weak and lowly people, this is a bit ambiguous because obviously people committed to social justice are very concerned about the weak and lowly, but overall society doesn't necessarily seem to be moving in the right direction on some of those things. Enemies and injustice, the enemy test, certainly the outrage culture that we're experiencing would indicate that we're not doing well on that one. So that's just a quick whistle-stop tour of the first 4 tests.
Thank you. Andrew.
Thanks, Brian. I loved it at the beginning where you gave some representatives of expressive individualism with those great cultural sort of authority of Taylor Swift and Shane Warne and so forth, and you presented it to us in some grabs from them.
That's great, so thank you for that. Anyone else?
Did you find or interact with anyone who sort of would be a contemporary advocate for expressive individualism, who has sort of written a book saying, that it's advocating for it? Or is it the sort of thing that, is expressive individualism the sort of thing that by nature sort of exists in the sound bites, if you know what I mean?
It's a good question. Probably I've read more article length descriptions. So when you read about ethical issues, for example, in media, personal autonomy is very high on the list of values that need to be honoured. So with things like euthanasia, abortion, etc., personal autonomy is basically the whole story. People should be able to decide their own situations. I'd have to think about books that advocate more explicitly. If I think of something, I'll say it a bit later.
Got some questions popping up here. Do you want to read them?
Sure. Yep. How do you think about the connection of self-determinism and the rise of group determinism, tribalism? That is, identity attached to the tribe we aspire to be associated with. How do we... I'll do that one first? Yeah. Yes. Okay. Basically it's a good question and it needs to be clarified. So when people look inside themselves, they'll often come up with something that's part of a group. So you might find what's really significant for you, what defines you is you're a woman, or your ethnicity, yes? Or some other issue like that. So even though we're talking about expressive individualism, there is an irony there in that these groups will end up being significant for your identity. Group identity ends up creeping back in unawares. The Bible's very interesting about these things because it's very clear in the New Testament that, as I said earlier, these things are not downplayed. So the visions in the book of Revelation, you've still got tribes from every nation understood to be worshipping the Lamb. They're still there as tribes of every nation. But Paul has some remarkable things to say where he says there's no man or woman, no slave or free, etc. in Christ. So gender is covered, social status is covered, if you like. And then he also says in some remarkable verses in 1 Corinthians 7, let those who are married live as if they are not. Let those who have dealings with the world live as if they do not. Those who are happy not live as if they're not happy. Now, it's a kind of paradoxical, poetic few lines in the letter. And basically what he's saying is, don't make those things define you. And so there's a kind of, the Bible seems to oppose identity markers being made absolute rather than contingent. And in one sense, it's the definition of idolatry. The definition of idolatry in the Bible, one definition is that we trust, love and serve something in the place of God. But from the other direction, especially in a place like Romans 1, you've got idolatry as making the contingent, the created, absolute in some sense.
Thank you. Next question here.
Do you want to read to give me a break?
Well, sure. How do you encourage people to really think about the question, who am I, when many are too caught up with themselves to understand it is a real question, or so numbed by entertainment, drugs, medication or social media that they can't even comprehend the question?
I don't think it's that hard, actually. I think it is a topic that's in the air. And you could use one of the cultural icons that I listed earlier on. I think people are thinking about these things. Many people are quite willing to admit their own confusion about identity matters. But it's a good question. How do you engage with these questions in a way that's constructive and attractive? Good question.
How do you think the trends of modern identity have infiltrated the church, the body of Christ? Question says.
Look, all of these are good questions, and I'm just kind of shooting from the hip. So I think what the focus on identity, the obsession with identity in our society has definitely led to a kind of tribalism. And there is conflict in different areas of society on the basis of how you align yourself. So some people actually identify themselves politically as what defines them. I'm a Liberal Party voter, I'm a Labor Party voter, I'm a Greens voter. Yep. And I think it's fair to say in the past people would choose churches by their music styles or whether the program was good for their kids, and that probably still happens to some extent. But now we've got people choosing churches by whether they align with their main identity focus. So whether their political allegiance is reflected from the pulpit, whether the causes they're committed to is reflected in the church's program. It's complicated, isn't it? Because clearly there's nothing wrong. In the body of Christ, we can't all do everything. So there's just nothing wrong, of course, with some people having an issue or a cause they're committed to, they specialise in, if you like. But it can be divisive in the end if that becomes what defines a person and drives them in an exclusive sense.
Thank you. Rosemary.
The mic's coming.
Thank you for your lecture. There's lots to think about in there. My name's Rosemary, And I'd like to ask, where does the doctrine of creation sit in this topic?
Yep, good question. Yes, so basically the immediate answer most of you will think of is this notion of the image of God. Yep, so human beings are made in the image of God. So one answer to the question, who am I, is that I'm a being made in the image of God. And Christian thought has understood the image of God in all sorts of ways throughout the centuries. In terms of a task, where God's vice regents carrying out his work on earth, or in terms of attributes. So we have the image of God in terms of our creativity, our reason, something like that. I actually think in context and the usage of the term image of God has to do with us being part of God's family. So if you look at Genesis 5, there's a genealogy there that says that Cain was the son of Adam, made in his image. Have I got that right? I think so. Or is it Seth? I think it's Cain, or Abel perhaps. Anyway, one of his sons is said to be made in the image of Adam. So you get the sense that image of God language may be a familial term. And then when you come to the New Testament, Paul can say in the Areopagus speech in Acts 17, we are his offspring. Yep. So the idea that all human beings are in some sense children of God. And then you go to Luke chapter 3, there's a genealogy there, where it ends off, anyone know the last line? Adam, the son of God. Yep. So I think, I'm not suggesting that Christian thought has got it completely wrong, but I think the umbrella idea for image of God is really this familiar thing. We're in the image of God in the sense that we are his children. Now that was interrupted, and the Christian gospel is about being adopted back into God's family, yes? So there's a slight inconsistency there. So what has that got to do with identity? Well, I think it has a lot to do with it, because what that means is that our restoration, putting on the new self, will be in the image and likeness of our Creator in Colossians 3. And the image of Christ then becomes our ultimate identity. Now, don't mishear me again. I'm not suggesting that the identity that the Bible commends as being a child of God means that we're all the same. It's not that the particularities of our lives are obliterated, but they're seen in a different light. I'm still a father, a husband, a friend, a worker, but hopefully the kind of father, husband, friend and worker I'll become, because my core identity, I think sometimes the language, my superordinate identity is child of God. And that somehow affects all the other things. But certainly the child of God identity, just to get back to your question, actually goes back right to the beginning of the Bible and the notion of the image of God. Whoop, not good enough. Coming back for more.
We'll come to you, Mark. Rosemary's got another question. Do you want to follow up? Is that okay? Just one moment if you don't mind, Mark. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I wasn't specific enough, I suppose. I was thinking of the creator-creature distinction, the fact that I am a creature, with all that that means.
Well, certainly being a creature underscores our finitude, our mortality, etc. And there is a healthy dose in the Bible's approach to human identity, which underscores our capacity for evil. I mean, Jesus says to his own disciples, you being evil, even you know how to give good gifts to your children. So it's not a great selling point for Christianity necessarily, but the notion that every human being is capable of evil is fundamental to the distinction between us and the Creator. Maybe that's a bit more along the lines, although Rosemary's still not looking happy. That's okay. Yes. Yep. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? So basically, Another part of our creatureliness is the fact that we need to connect into a bigger story than just our own stories. And as I said earlier, we tend to do that anyway, either stories of our nations, classes, cultures, families. But being a creature means that we can play a small part in a much bigger story. Maybe that's another dimension.
Thank you. There's Mark up the back.
Here comes your tough question, Brian.
I thought they were all tough so far. But
I want to continue with the direction I was attempting to take Kirsten, an issue that Carl Truman slips in again and again in his major work. The leading, certainly the most widely and vociferously promulgated worldview is metaphysical naturalism, which is not dissimilar to the Epicurean one Paul was preaching against in Athens in Acts 17. And it teaches we are but the products of an almost infinitely long series of chemical accidents, that suffering, disease are the norm, and the scientific and logical end is death. There is a large, if not dominant, section of the church that teaches so much of this pagan worldview as how God created nature and even mankind. Since the church teaches this, isn't the church complicit in non-Christians turning inwards, prioritising the psychological trumping true ontology?
was that your own words, or was that?
No, that's me.
No, that was
That's
you.
me.
I just want to know if that was Carl. Look, that's a really big question, as you warned me, and it kind of gets to the heart of so many issues, doesn't it? So how are we to understand the creation narratives? Yep, in the opening chapters of Genesis and elsewhere. Look, it's a disputable matter, and Christians disagree. I'm not sure personally that to subscribe to some kind of theistic evolution necessarily means that we have to take on all of those corollaries that you listed. I know that's not going to satisfy you, but that's my short answer.
A lot of Christians misunderstand evolution. They actually don't read what the evolutionist theory says. Death is essential in evolution. If the church is pushing that idea, you've got to accept the whole package. And that's why it's pagan. You can't get around death. Death is being natural. Paul says death is the last enemy. Throughout the Bible, it's an enemy, but evolution has to embrace it. And yet the church runs with that idea, and that's what I'm saying, is that the church has to be complicit. And it's the laws of logic, excluded middle and non-contradiction, say that you can't have apples and oranges all mixed together. It's either one or the other.
Okay, I'll take that as a comment. Yep, yeah, which is fair enough. Good, thank you. I think there's a gentleman down the front.
Yeah, we're coming to you. Colin, I think it is.
Thank you for your lecture. Theologically, shouldn't we affirm that redemption comes before creation? You refer to the mystery of our Lord Jesus Christ, but surely if we understand Christology in a Trinitarian sense, the Lamb was slain before the foundation of the world, and the ultimate story and narrative must be that from all eternity, it was Almighty God's free, unrestrained, loving act to become man for us in Jesus Christ. And I want you to comment on that. Also, would you comment on perhaps Kierkegaard's understanding of Abraham on Mount Moriah and how that was definitive for the formation of the self?
Well, with respect to the Kierkegaard question, I can't comment because I don't know it, so I'm sorry about that. And your first point, certainly the notion of God having in mind a plan of salvation from all eternity is clear. I'm not a systematic theologian nor a philosopher nor the son of a philosopher, so I just don't have a good answer to try and work out how that fits with the problem of evil and the unfolding of human history and its relationship to our identity matters today. Yeah, that's all I've got, sorry.
Only late in life have I come across this idea that redemption comes before creation. Most of my life, I was, brought up on this idea that God created a perfect world, human beings started out, and redemption comes in afterwards. And God had to send Jesus to fix up the mess that we created. But anyway.
Thank you, and I think it's now time to give our lecturer some rest and to draw this question time to a close. So thank you for all those that have contributed to that. I'd now like to call on the Bishop of South Sydney, the Reverend Dr. Michael Stead, to come and move a vote of thanks. Thank you, Michael.
It is my very great privilege to be able to propose a vote of thanks for Brian for helping us to think clearly and rightly and biblically about personal identity. Many of us are doubly blessed. Some of you, me included, were here back in 2017 when Brian spoke on the topic of identity at the lectures. I found those lectures to be really, really helpful. A helpful both critique of expressive individualism and also presenting a valid, viable, compelling Christian alternative. And then tonight we get a second bite of the cherry, not because you didn't get it right last time, but really we get the benefit of all those lectures distilled down into a book, which is available for sale up the back, as well as updated for what's been happening in the last little while. It couldn't be more timely to be focusing on personal identity. As Brian has highlighted, and even more so since 2017, expressive individualism has become the air that we breathe. Each individual sits at the centre of their existence, each the arbiter of what constitutes authenticity. The motto of our age is, "You be you." The authentic you is the one that you feel yourself inside to be. And as Brian has helpfully shown us, this exercise in self-definition, while not without worth, is ultimately doomed to failure because we don't have the resources within to construct ourselves. Whether you follow Descartes and ground identity in rationalism, or in the Romantics and grounded in emotion, or follow Freud and make sexual identity central, all of those are intrinsic, not extrinsic, and therefore insecure, or as Brian has put it, identity like that is fragile. Rene Descartes walked into a McDonald's and he ordered a Big Mac, and the spotty teenager serving him said, "Would you like fries with that, sir?" To which Descartes replied, "I think not," and disappeared in a puff of logic. It's little wonder in a world... Sorry, that was a very bad joke. It is little wonder in a world that is so focused on identity it is little wonder that in a world that is so focused on identity, that is so poorly founded, that so many are struggling with issues of identity. So, Brian, thank you very much for your insightful critique of expressive individualism. Not only is it fragile, it also fails to lead to the good life. A particular takeaway for me tonight was the addition of the fifth test to what were previously only 4 tests for the good life. In the same way that it's just not cricket if there's not a fifth day, likewise the fifth test, the enjoyment test, was a necessary completion to the set for me. Likewise, it was really helpful again to be reminded tonight that looking inwards is a faulty foundation for identity, and that we do need to look in other directions, looking around to relationships, looking backwards and forwards to our identity found in shared narratives, and ultimately and especially looking upward to God, that our identity is found in being known by God. Because the modern identity project is so fragile and flawed and faulty, it fails to deliver the security, significance and the satisfaction we crave. And Brian has really helped us to see that tonight. Brian, more importantly though, has given us a Christian approach to identity foundation, which provides the resources that we need. Our identity is not to be found in the meta-narratives of secular materialism or the meta-narratives of social justice. But there is a better story to live within, the story of Jesus Christ and us as bit players in that story. Brian, there's so much more I could say to thank you, but I think I'll leave it there. Would you please join with me in thanking Brian for a stimulating lecture?
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, everyone. It just remains me to wrap up very briefly. Right. Thank you for joining us tonight. Refreshments will be served. Please feel welcome to enjoy our hospitality here. Just some very brief closing remarks. We make the New College lectures available for free as a service to Australian society. We are a not-for-profit organisation. If you have appreciated the lecture, we do welcome gifts to support the scholarships of the young people that live in our communities. And if you go to our website, you can see our alumni and supporters page, and there's a portal by which you can give to support our scholarships here. If you know someone who's coming to UNSW next year, and would benefit from living in these outstanding communities, if they just quote the 2022 New College lecture to our admissions officer, we will waive their normal admission fee. Look, and up the back here you'll find the journal that's published within our college. Finding Yourself contains an extract from Brian, which is the most recently released edition, plus a compilation of issues associated with identity that we've assembled over the last 10 years. And there's special prices on the subscription at the back this evening. On the 21st of November, we'll be hosting Associate Professor Chris Watkin from Monash University, who is launching his latest book, which is called Biblical Critical Theory. This is a great book in which Chris specifically responds to some contemporary objections to Christianity that have emerged over the last 150 years. So for your diaries, the 21st of November, we'll have a book launch here with Chris Watkin. If we go back to the midst of COVID, for those that are familiar with CASE, we had discussion about Origins this evening, there is an edition on Origins which is available up the back. In March next year, we'll be inviting Professor Darryl Falk and Dr. Todd Wood to come and visit us here in Sydney. This will be on the 16th of March, is my memory. I didn't write that down here, but it's about mid-March. We will send out details later, but they will actually address these questions of science and origins, and in fact represent the polar opposites on this issue. The other issue for your diary is the New College lectures for 2023 are happening, and they'll be from the 10th to the 12th of October next year. We're still finalising the details, but you'll receive the announcement soon. I'll just finish by, again, thank you for joining us this evening. Please stay and enjoy our hospitality, and please continue to enjoy your evening. Thank you very much.